Hey, so I'm here with Jerry Ordway, legendary writer artist who I'm sure a lot of you guys know, who's had a long storied career at DC and Marvel. And he inked Crisis on Infinite Earths. He famously was working on Superman in the 90s during the sort of reboot era and death of Superman um uh era. I'm repeating that word again. But yeah, I mean, it's great to have you here, Jerry. I guess we'll just get straight into it.
Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm thrilled to talk to you. I mean, I'm an absolute huge fan. And so I guess the first work you sort of did was like you basically were more in self-publishing at first, and you went to like a comic convention and like had like the promise of work and ultimately ended up like inking a lot at DC. Like, do I have that roughly right?
Kind of. I tried to get it. I tried to get into DC and Marvel. I did made a trip in I think 1978 from Wisconsin, where I was living at the time, to New York, and then got turned down. Went back to my hometown, and I was working. I wound up going to work at an art studio. It was a place that did advertising, layout, finish, illustration, all kinds of stuff. So I started kind of
Hmm.
as an apprentice and worked there for a couple of years. And then in like late '79, I guess I started doing coloring book stuff through the studio I was working with. And I did a DC superheroes coloring book, and I did a Marvel workbook set, like 4 books in a little box for Western Publishing. So I had like a little brush with comics because the people at the studio knew I liked comics.
Hmm.
So I took my samples in 1980 in the summer. Chicago Comic Con, they were doing a talent search, and Joe Orlando was looking at art. So I took my samples from the DC coloring book with me, and basically sat in a hallway from about 10 in the morning till about 5 at night on a
Huh.
Saturday of the convention. And just each time get a little closer, a little closer. And I was just worried, like, I'd be at right, the next guy coming, and then Joe Orlando would leave or something. But
Right.
luckily, Paul Levitz kept coming in and telling him, and I was hearing all this. Like, Paul would come in and say, "Joe, you've been working all day. Let's take a break." And Joe was like, "No, no, these guys are waiting. I'm gonna see everybody." So
Wow.
when it was my turn, he was really punch drunk. He was kind of like just tired from a whole day of looking at samples and
Yeah.
talking to strangers. And he's looking at my samples, and I have like Wonder Woman, find Wonder Woman stars in the picture, because it was an activity book. So the
Right.
stars were spread out in the picture, and she didn't have stars on her costume. And he's totally confused, like, why doesn't she have? Where are her stars? And I'm like trying to explain it to him, and it was getting nowhere. And then Paul Levitz comes in one last time to see if he can drag him away for dinner. Paul comes in and says, "Joe, we gotta," and he looks down at the art and he goes, "Oh, Jerry Ordway, we've been trying to, contact you."
Oh,
And I was like,
wow.
"What?" So, because I was working through this studio through Western Publishing, there was two levels of, you know, uh, not having my name on anything. So,
Right. And this is in a different era where like if it's not just like, oh, we'll just email them. Like,
right,
no, this is
right,
a different world.
right. They couldn't really contact me through Western Publishing, because that would be cool, because, Western probably wouldn't want to give up that info
Right.
either.
Right.
So yeah, so Paul just got my phone number, and then the next, like within a couple of days when I got back from the con, I got a call, and they offered me I think it was a 6-page story or something, which was penciled by Carmine Infantino.
Hmm.
And it was like crazy scary, because he was doing this weird pencil style where it had no blacks in it. It
Huh.
was all very open, kind of super stylized. So I just jumped in and added blacks and did what I mean, I figured I got nothing to lose. So that was my first ink job. I think it was also, I think Mark DeMatteis had written the story too, which is kind of funny. So I turned that in. They liked it. They sent me a Trevor Von Eden story, another, like, they were all for like the House of Mystery, like little short stories.
Okay.
And this was 1980, so they still had the anthology books going. And I did the Trevor Von Eden one the next week, and then they sent me the War That Time Forgot, which was the uh, war stories with dinosaurs.
Right.
It was,
Kind of weird war.
yeah. And then I got I think I got a Creature Commandos or something as well. And by that point, I'm still working full time. And they called me at some point in, like, say, this is started in August, or, July, August, September. So by October, I get a call and they offered me Teen Titans with inking over George Perez.
Hmm.
And by that point, the book, like, at least 3 issues had come out. So it was like, don't you already have an inker? They were like, oh, George isn't happy with the inker. We'd love you to do it. And I was like, I can't quit. I have a full-time job. I was nervous about committing to a freelance life. So I turned it down. And then,
Wow.
a month later, they offered again. And meantime, I'd been talking to my friends, and, John Beatty was a friend of mine through the mail and through fanzines. And John Beatty had just started getting work. And he was saying, you got to try it, give it a shot, and it's like, you're going to look back on it and say, why didn't I try this? Or why didn't I do this? And
Hmm.
so he was bugging me. And Mike Macklin was a friend of mine in Milwaukee. And Mike was saying, what's the worst that can happen? You give it a shot. So I did agree to do All-Star Squadron, because Roy Thomas was, the Avengers writer. And that was my favorite book that Marvel did. So that was it. I mean, I started freelancing in February of 1981. So it's a long time.
Yeah, yeah. So you were inking on Teen Titans? I mean, at that time,
No,
correct?
no. They wanted me to.
Oh,
But
okay. I hear.
yeah,
Because when you say that, it's like, wasn't that book like, that was like one of the hottest books at that time, wasn't it? Or am I
yeah,
wrong?
there was, I think I said 3 issues maybe had been out at that point had come out. So I knew it was a popular, book or whatever, but I also knew that they had an inker on it. So I felt, I think it was a little bit of that feeling like, well, there's already a guy doing it. I don't want to
Right.
displace somebody. But I also was working full time, and I had my mind set on being an illustrator. And, when you're in any kind of company, there's like a path. You could see a path to, how do you get to the top job? And
Right.
I was feeling like, oh, there might be an opportunity, because the illustrators that they had working at this place, the 2 guys were kind of old at that point, not old, relatively speaking, they were in their 50s. And I thought, well, that's, in a couple of years, I might be able to move up to that one of those slots. And then what happened was, one of the guys who was going to leave decided to stay. And I thought, well, now that, puts me a couple of years further back. So I kind of decided that it was worth it, taking a chance on the DC stuff. So,
Hmm.
but yeah, that it was funny. In December of 80, I was in New York City, and I had not met Mike Zeck before. I knew who he was, but John Beatty said, oh, you should, definitely call up Mike Zeck. He'll show you around. And so this friend of mine, we were both going to the Illustrators Workshop, which was Bob Peak, Bernie Fuchs, Mark English. These were the top illustrators. They had a workshop that was going on over a weekend, and you'd pay, I think it was a couple $100, and then you had to do your own travel and hotel. But they would have like a series of seminars, which each of the artists would give. So this other person I worked with at this art studio and I both decided we want to do that. And in being in New York City, I'll also go up and see, meet DC people. Meet Len Wein was going to be my editor, and then we'd also go up to Marvel and try to, just I think Mike Zeck took us up to Marvel, and so it was like a lot packed into that weekend, or into that. It was like a Friday through Sunday or Monday morning.
Yeah.
We flew back, and that was I think John Lennon was killed over that.
Wow.
I forget,
That weekend?
I don't remember what day he was killed, but it was like we got back and it was like John Lennon was shot. It was like, whoa.
Huh.
So it's just funny, the little weird things that you remember. Because I also remember, I think I'd met Joe Rubenstein for the first time at that point as a professional. I saw him up at DC, and I think he and Mike Zeck and this friend of mine, Connie, and I went to dinner or something. And Joe, I really was a big fan of Joe's work and everything. And Joe was immediately trying to ask me what kind of pen tips I used, and did I use brush, and it was all the shop talk stuff. So it was kind of fun. And I'd only been, again, working part-time for 6 months at most at that point. So clearly people had seen what I was doing. So I must have had, within the industry, I guess people had liked what I was doing. So I guess that was a positive.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the reason I ask about the Teen Titans thing is like, from my perspective, it's like at this time you must have been, early 20s, right? Like probably 22 or 23. And it's like they're offering you, hey, do you want to ink on,
Right.
a book that is essentially like DC's X-Men, like,
Right.
the one of
Oh yeah,
the biggest titles in the industry right now,
it would have been a big opportunity. But at the same time, I was getting ink work, but I wanted a pencil. I was not like happy with, DC decides they needed people who could do finishes. So that was kind of the niche that they wanted to fill, because I could pencil, but they knew that I could take layouts and especially from the Infantino thing right off the bat. I mean, they could see that I could take sketchy pencils and turn them into more, grounded comic illustrations. So, but I felt like even at that point, like Titans was not really a known quantity as being huge. Again, 3 issues in, I had read it and I liked it, but it really kind of built. I think it probably hit that everybody buying it around issue 8 or 10. So I would have been in that vein, but I also feel like I might have been a little more stuck if I had done that, because George stayed with that book for a long time.
Right. I mean, was there a fear for you that's like, once I become an inker for this, now I'm known primarily as that. I'm an inker.
Yeah.
And
No, that's how it works. I mean, you do something, and here's how the company sees you. This is your function.
And it's hard to change that.
Yeah. So, I mean, from the time I started getting the ink work, I started bugging them about doing penciling stuff. And they were like, we'll keep you busy. We've got more inking work available than we have penciling work. And I knew they just wanted to, they liked what I was doing. And once I started on Buckler on the All-Star Squadron, Rich would do kind of weird pencils. They weren't traditional layouts, but they were kind of really somewhat unfinished in places and a little bit slapdash, I would say. And I don't mean that in a bad way, because he was, this guy was drawing like 4 pages a day. He must have been drawing 2 books at least when I was doing that. And yeah, it was. I mean, the challenge there was that I knew I could kind of make a mark on it too, because when you get something that's like when Perez was doing his thing, George was always really a really tight penciler, and you could tell that just from looking at the finished stuff.
So there wasn't much you could really
I
add
think
to
it would
it,
have
I
been.
guess.
Yeah, I wouldn't have shown. I wouldn't have been as noticeable, I guess. But like with Buckler, Rich was doing his Neil Adams kind of phase. So it was a lot of Neil Adams swipes, and Dick Giordano had been inking a lot of that and bringing it full circle to make it look like Neil Adams. So when I got All-Star Squadron pages, my first thought was, this book is set in the 1940s. I want to try to ink it in a way that looks appropriate to the 1940s. So, I was a big fan of Wally Wood's All-Star comics from a couple of years earlier. And that was my approach. I just thought, as long as these are finished, I'm doing finishes, I have the leeway to do this. I just tried to give it a little bit more of a nostalgic look. And, DC, Len Wein liked it. Roy Thomas seemed to like it, although Roy was, I think the first thing he told me when I talked to him on the phone was that he had hoped that Dick Giordano would ink the book. And I was like, oh, well, thanks. And he was, it was a weird relationship because he was good and bad. I mean, as a boss, he was technically not my boss. Len Wein was the editor, but Roy was kind of like he wouldn't like just let somebody else do stuff. Roy was so proactive on even the little editing details and things. So he would do single line spaced critiques of every page I did, panel by panel. And I would get these dense typed pages from him, like 2 or 3 pages. I think the first issue was like 4 pages, and it was really nitpicky stuff. Like elbows and knees are too pointy or something. It was just weird. So as I went along, and I'm inking, right? I'm not the guy who's penciling. As it went along, these critiques continued.
So the critiques are going to you and not the penciler?
Yeah. No,
so
no.
What should you do? Like round off the elbow?
Yeah.
Like,
it was just funny. It was funny. So he did that for the entire time that I was inking the book. I would get the little critiques, and they got, by the end of my inking on that book, they were down to maybe a page or a page and a half, but it was literally panel by panel. Here's what you did wrong, or here's what you could do different, or it was just, I look back on it now, and it was probably good for me because it made me not take anything for granted. I knew I would have to work hard, so I couldn't, at an early stage in my career, I definitely couldn't coast. I mean, I felt like I had to give 150% every time I, put the pen to paper. So that was kind of a good thing. But the downside of it is I felt like I never was really appreciated. I mean, I was constantly getting these critiques, and I think even when I left the book, when I was penciling it, and then when I left totally, I just felt like, wow, I'm never going to satisfy this guy, and that was.
And Roy, he had already been, I guess, he was the first editor-in-chief of Marvel after Stan Lee. He'd already done that at that point.
Yeah, yeah. And he had been kind of, I mean, I want to say chased from Marvel by Jim Shooter, but a lot of those, Len Wein, Marv Wolfman, Doug Mensch, Roy, Jerry Conway, I think they all kind of got chased out of Marvel because Shooter didn't want anybody to be a writer editor. He wanted the editorial to be firmly in the office and not with freelancers, which, again, I understand that. But so that was DC's gain. They got Marv, they got, Len, they got Jerry Conway, they got Doug Mensch, they got Roy Thomas, but yeah, Roy was still an editor at heart. So it was just funny. He was very hard. I think he was hard on himself too. But from my perspective of being a young guy, this is my first full-time project. I felt kind of like, boy, I was like in that class at school where the teacher just didn't seem to like you,
No, yeah. I mean, I'm listening to this, and I'm a writer, and I'm working on a bunch of different comics that ultimately are going to be on Kickstarter and various places. And to me, it's like unimaginable to me that I would go through every single thing. And, I
Yeah.
would say 99 times out of 100, I just want the artist to do what they're going to do. And I'm not going to
Yeah.
I'm not
And
going to
that,
micromanage them to hell and stuff.
yeah, well, micromanage is a good word. I mean, I think, and again, I can't say that he was wrong. I just think he was a little too picky, but he was like that, I think, um, because that book was the comic that he probably wanted to write when he was a 10-year-old kid or whatever,
Hmm.
So I think
Right.
he didn't have the same perspective on it. I think in a similar way, but less uh, obsessive compulsive was maybe Byrne on Fantastic Four. That clearly that was a book that he lived his whole life wanting to do.
Huh.
Um, you know what I mean? There's a
And
point where
yeah, I mean, this was kind of the first crop of artists that were sort of, like Jack Kirby was never a fan of the Fantastic Four. He created the
right,
Fantastic Four.
right,
This next
exactly,
generation grew
yeah,
up on it.
yeah. We're all inspired by that Marvel stuff from the '60s, whereas you know I mean, Kirby was there when it started.
Yeah,
I mean, he
comic
was there
books didn't even
when comics
exist
started.
practically before he started
Yeah.
doing it.
So I mean, those guys looked up to the comic strip artists like Alex Raymond and Hal Foster and Milton Caniff. That was their version of me looking up to John Buscema or Kirby or Gil Kane or Steve Ditko or whoever.
Now,
But
just going backwards a little bit in time here, I saw that you were reading Marvel in like around 1967,
yeah,
and to me that just jumped out because it's like that's the time that's sort of, I think you could say, almost like, I know it's not technically the golden age, but it's like sort of the golden age of Marvel, so to speak. And I'm
yeah,
just curious about that, like you know Stan Lee is writing Spider-Man. It's probably John Romita
yeah,
Sr. on Spider-Man at that time. Jack Kirby is probably still working at Marvel. And I'm
yeah.
just
He's doing
curious about that era, like you were a kid at that time.
yeah,
And this like,
yeah. Well, I was in we my brother Joel was 2 years older than me. He and I started watching the Marvel superheroes cartoon,
hmm,
which was syndicated. So it was on right after, like in the afternoon, right after we could run home from school
hmm.
basically and be at home by 3:30 when the show started because it was a half hour a day. And I
It's
don't know if
funny
you've
because it's
ever
just like I had the
have you
same experience as a kid, just with like the Spider-Man cartoon. It's just funny,
yeah.
it's like
Well,
spans across generations.
are you familiar with the Marvel superheroes
I'm
cartoons?
familiar with it. I mean, I've probably seen clips of it and stuff, but I'm talking
Yeah,
about like the 90s Spider-Man.
yeah.
But I know what you're
No,
talking about though.
so these were like done in a serialized format. There were three cartoons and a half-hour segment. So there were three cartoons, but each, depending on which area you grew up in, they were shown in different ways in different areas, I guess. But in Milwaukee, they would show three separate characters. So you had Iron Man, say Captain America, and Thor on a given day. Each of those stories were three parts. So, say Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday was going to be all three parts. And then the Thursday, you'd have a different rotation, maybe the Hulk, Submariner, and Captain America or something like that. So it was this weird thing that made you come back each day because the story continued, And I've talked to other friends of mine, who remembered that era, and they said that their local station would run all three of the same character each day so that you got a complete story rather than having part one, part two, part three over 3 days. You would get all three parts of the Captain America story, for example. And I was like, I think that would not be as good because we really had this cliffhanger feel,
Right. You
like, oh
didn't
my
know what you were
God,
going to
how are they going
get.
to get out of this? And the
Right.
the other thing, that was cool was as bad as those cartoons were animated, they had good voice acting. They also had the comic panels were kind of taken out of the comics and they tried to do minimal animation, but you had Kirby, like if a Captain America was a Kirby figure or, all the artists who were doing it at that point. So
Hmm.
it was a good primer for comics. And I had no clue that they had comics of the Marvel superheroes. There was nothing that said, go to your local newsstand and buy Marvel comics. It was just, oh, this is a cartoon show. So after, again, it started in 66. In 1967, my family went to Colorado, where my oldest brother Mike was graduating from college. Mike is, got 16 years on me. So
Oh, wow.
we go to the train station, and my mom gives my brother Joel and me $1 to buy comics, so we have something to read on the train. It's the first time we saw a comic book spinner rack, because there was nothing like that in our neighborhood. So we saw all these characters that were on TV. It was like, wow. So we picked up Thor, we picked up Tales of Suspense with Captain America and Iron Man, Submariner and Hulk, and Tales to Astonish. And then, I took a chance on Spider-Man, and I took a chance on Daredevil. And I think my brother bought Fantastic Four or something. So we're just loving our train ride, because we're reading these things. We had no clue that these were that they made comics. It's just funny. But the Spider-Man is funny. There was Spider-Man where he's walking away from his costume in the garbage
Oh
can.
my God.
And
That's
I
the
just,
issue that you
yeah,
got on that?
yeah, I
Oh
was
my
so
God.
intrigued as a kid. Like, wait, superheroes don't quit. How is this possible? And the other one that's more funny, really, was Daredevil. I think it was issue 29. He was being unmasked on the cover, and it was a Gene Colan drawing. And Daredevil had these, because Matt Murdock had these big 1970s giant sunglasses.
Right.
And the mask is coming off, and those sunglasses are there. And as a kid,
Under the mask.
I wasn't quite 10 years old. I was like, how does that work? This is, just compelling to figure out how something so wrong could work, that I had to pick up that comic.
It's
But
funny, you think, like, we kind of forget, but like at that time, those books were like fairly innovative. Like you said, superhero doesn't just quit. Like
yeah,
that's
no, it was amazing.
that's
Well, that was the whole thing. Even though in 67, the formula was still that things are going to go wrong for these guys. Nobody has got a perfect life. Captain America's haunted by World War II and the death of Bucky, and Iron Man, is got his heart problems, and he has to find an outlet to plug his armor into because he's having a heart attack or something.
right.
It was crazy stuff, but it definitely impacted on me as a kid, because it felt more real, even though it was fantastical. It also was interesting that it was New York City. It wasn't a fake Gotham City or Metropolis. It was New
Right.
York City. It was like, it kind of added to the feeling that they had more reality to them, even though they were still dopey comics,
Right. It kind of mythologizes New York City
Yeah,
a little bit.
it did. It did, definitely.
It's like a fantastical place.
Right, where superheroes fly around.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, that's part of the genius of those books. It's like Spider-Man is swinging around in these buildings. It's it turns these skyscrapers into this kind of like, fairy tale world. I mean,
Oh yeah. And I remember the first time I didn't get to go to New York City until I think it was 77. And I remember looking for Steve Ditko water towers, because that was like such a distinct thing in the Ditko
right.
Spider-Mans, was that he had the the water towers on the buildings for, because they obviously, I didn't realize that you needed gravity to pump
Right.
water up
Right.
10,
That's right. Yeah.
10 stories. So they filled up a tank on the roof, and there you get your water pressure. But yeah, it's funny thinking back on that, because it really was like a night and day situation between Marvel and DC. And even as a 10-year-old, I felt like DC's were for little kids, whereas Marvel were for me. Even though I wasn't even 10. It was just the idea that I was clearly more sophisticated by buying Marvel comics.
That was the genius of it, though, and I know that on all those covers, people can be critical of Stan Lee, but he was really brilliant in the sense of like that he was talking directly to you on those
Oh yeah,
covers in a way that just like DC was not,
yeah. Well, I
Um,
mean, DC, honestly, the big difference, and I think the key difference between the two is kind of that DC already was a big company. DC was already Disney in a sense.
right.
When you look at like Superman went through that same thing that Mickey Mouse or Donald Duck or any of the characters on the cartoons. Once you get really popular, people are looking at you. You can't do anything controversial because, you don't want somebody to protest Superman, you know, doing
Yeah.
something. So,
Superman came to mean something a little bit
yeah,
more than just like
right.
Daredevil, for instance.
Right. And they by that, virtue of that, they were more safe. And I think that's how they did their books. Their books generally were more safe, and they were a little bit more kid friendly, dumbed down in a way.
Hmm.
Um, the only DC books in that 60s era that were kind of exciting, and I'm saying this as an adult when I read these things, as old books,
Yeah, like 50 years ago.
was
More.
Doom Patrol,
Right.
Metamorpho. Those were actually Marvel type books. They
Hmm.
were actually very, very trying to break the mold and very
Right.
non DC.
Like Metamorpho was almost like the Thing or something,
Yeah,
he was
yeah. He's a monster and he's got to deal with it. And he's, Doom Patrol, same thing. There's so many things in Doom Patrol that were kind of ahead of their time in that same vein that Marvel was. I mean, Doom Patrol had a character, someone who wanted to be in the Doom Patrol, and they reject him, and he becomes a
hmm.
super villain. And they have,
Yeah, and that's now a staple of
it
like comic
becomes a
book
staple.
movies and stuff.
Exactly. And that's the thing that, so in a way, that could never happen to Superman or Batman or Wonder Woman because those characters were too big for DC to worry about any controversy or whatever.
Right, like
So it
that
kind
would
of,
come across as like mean-spirited on
yeah.
Superman's part.
Well, and in that way, they lost that generation of readers to a degree.
Hmm.
They were at the top. They were selling a gazillion copies of Superman, but it was the book that everybody kind of felt was too safe. And if you're a kid, boy, these other books are so much more exciting. And Marvel had that, like you said, Stan Lee would put so much copy on the covers. The
Yeah,
covers, the cover,
he'd be saying like, this is the greatest book you've ever seen. Like he'd
right? And
literally
you
be saying that.
turn to page 22 for a secret or a special surprise or something, or you won't believe what happens. It was almost
Yeah,
like the
man.
internet. It's like internet advertising now. Doctors
Right.
hate this man. Well, turn to
Right.
page
Yeah.
25 to find out.
I sometimes think if Stan Lee were like a young man today, he would be like a YouTube superstar, like he just would be, like the bombast and like the energy and excitement. I know people can be critical of him, including myself, but just the kind of stuff you're talking about is like he saw an opening to, it's like DC was never going to do this kind of stuff. And so
Yeah.
that meant that there was an opening for that, for
Well,
these
they
kind of
said,
stories.
that they had this deal where when they did start selling better, Stan never wanted anybody to talk about it or to tout the sales because he felt like they were always better off being number two, even if they were
Huh.
selling better than
He wanted to
DC.
be an underdog.
Yeah, and it's true. I mean, I think that you feel like you root for the underdog more than you do for. I mean, I don't know where you're from, and I'm not a huge sports fan, but for example, we had the New England Patriots when Tom Brady was at his peak. Most everybody in New England kind of hated them because they always won. They
Right.
were almost like they were clearly taken for granted in that sense, but they also were kind of reviled because they were so successful. And it is that, you kind of pull for the guy who's going to knock that guy
Right.
off or that
You want to
team
see
off.
something impossible happen. You don't want to
Yeah,
see the guaranteed winner win
right.
again,
And that's I think that always exists in a way. Whenever anything becomes too big, it becomes a target.
Hmm.
I mean, that's the way we are. It's you build up a star, you build somebody up, and then, a lot of people take a lot of joy in tearing them down, you
Right.
know,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you see that happen almost every day.
and it happened.
Um,
I mean, it happens in comics. I lived through that era, which is really kind of crazy to think about, but all these guys that you think of as like my heroes, John Buscema was a big hero of mine.
hmm.
Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko, they all, Gil Kane, they all live long enough to where people go, yeah, they don't have it anymore. Or, yeah, Jack Kirby can't sell a comic, or Gil Kane can't sell a comic, whatever. And I always felt terrible about that, to hear people talk like that, because again, the funny part is I'd feel it myself. I'd be reading the books, and I remember when Kirby when he first went from Marvel to DC, and he did the New Gods, and he did the Demon and Commandy and all those books.
All
That
genius
was the
stuff.
that was the greatest period. I loved that period so much. Then he went back to Marvel in '75, and he did Captain America, and I was still kind of with him, but it wasn't as exciting. And then he did his Pacific comic stuff, and then he came back to DC. And there's a point where you hear this, just going into comic stores as many years as I have, where people start complaining. And it's like, you know what? I'll tell you, even a Kirby at his late stages, you would love to see that now. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
It's like once these guys have passed away, you are not going to get any more of this. Same with Buscema. Buscema, late stage Buscema was like, he's not as good as he was, and blah blah blah. But when you look at that stuff now, it's still head and shoulders above what most any other person can do. Which is just funny. So there's that perception, I think, of seeing somebody at their peak, and then the slow progression of them not being able to compete with their past work, which is tough for any creative person, because you're
Yeah,
always going to.
definitely. I mean, I could be wrong. I mean, I'm not the biggest expert on this, but from my perspective, it's like Steve Ditko, he worked like on his own stuff like fairly late into life, right? And it
Yeah,
was
he
still,
did.
it still was pretty much like Steve Ditko to my eye.
Yeah.
Like maybe he was not as good as when
Well,
he was 30 or whatever, but
yeah. But I mean, and again, I respect the hell out of the fact, even though I didn't agree with his objectivism or whatever that's
right,
called, and Rand stuff, but
right.
he was doing the self-publishing into, I think, up until in his 80s,
Yeah, I
you know,
mean, he went,
and they
basically
were,
until he died, pretty much, I
yeah,
think.
and they were, I think the biggest complaint I would have is that they were less art than they were diatribe. That he'd
Right,
have
right, right,
whole pages of copy, you know,
right.
which is funny now that I mentioned the Ayn Rand thing, because that's certainly, if you've ever made it through Atlas Shrugged,
No,
there's
I
like
haven't.
I couldn't do it in book form. I did it in audible form, and it just amazed me, because there's a point 3/4 of the way through the book, or maybe closer to the end, where the one character reads a manifesto that goes on the audio book, it goes on for about 6 hours. And I was like, whoa. if, if you
Didn't
have
you
to
you
six
inked Steve
hour
Ditko at one point, didn't you?
I inked them once. Yeah, it was
Hmm.
thrilling. I inked them on a Black Lightning story for Outsiders.
Huh. Did you ever
It
talk
was
to him or?
No, no. You know what? I'm smart enough not to
Right.
solicit. Like I had a couple of things that were really. I got to ink Kirby while Jack was still alive. I got to ink, like, I inked a couple of pages for Phantom Force, which the Image guys, we all donated our efforts. Nobody got a page rate or anything. We just wanted Kirby to get like some Image royalties. So
Right.
they did the 2 issues of Phantom Force. And the first issue, on the first issue, the pages that I inked were actual Kirby penciled pages
Huh.
from, I think, a couple. They were kind of incorporated from, one was from a Bruce Lee comic that he had drawn maybe 10, 15 pages of, that they turned into Phantom Force, like basically, took pages here and did bridging pages to make the story make sense.
Okay,
But
interesting.
yeah, but so that was really thrilling. I got to ink Kirby. I
And
got to
on the
ink Gil.
pencils themselves, like on the
Yeah, yeah,
on the
yeah.
page.
and I got to ink Gil Kane on a Doomsday annual, which was fun. I got to ink Ditko on that Outsiders thing, which was just so cool. I got to ink John Buscema. That was like in '99. I got to ink a Buscema Thor issue.
Hmm.
And I was like, okay, I'm done. The only guy that I wanted to ink and didn't get a chance to was Gene Colan. Because I was a fan of Daredevil as a kid. So
Hmm.
I had one opportunity and it was just a wrong time and it never came around again. But I got to ink Don Heck. I mean, I got to meet a lot of these guys, which was kind of fun. I got to ink Jim Mooney.
You said
And,
just before we started the call that you had met Jack Kirby a couple times. So I'm
oh,
just
yeah.
curious about that. I don't know if it was just more of just like a passing, meeting
Oh,
or
no, no.
something.
We
But
actually, in '84, I think it was '84, Jack was a guest of honor at Chicago Comic Con.
hmm,
And I think he had come back to DC. He had done, DC had given him, like, Jeanette Kahn was really a good person and a good administrator. She brought Jack in when the Superpowers toy line was um, proposed. And
hmm.
she said, if we would love to give you creator equity on these characters, and we'll do it retroactively if you will do a couple of new things. So he drew the Superpowers comic.
I really like that book too.
And well, and they
Superpowers.
basically they retroactively gave him his character equity, which means he would get 10% of licensing. Any licensing money he would get 10% of. And this Marvel never did this for him. So
Hmm.
the fact that they did. So, anyways, Jack was a guest of honor. DC flew him into Chicago. I knew Dick Giordano and Pat Bastine Pat was the editorial coordinator. Dick was I think he was the managing editor was his title. Anyways, we all get together. Dick's like, oh, we're gonna invite the Kirbys to dinner. Do you know a good place in Chicago? We were like, sure. So there's a great um, Chinese restaurant down in the Loop. So we make reservations, big group of us, maybe 12 of us. And so we have a nice, relaxing dinner, and it was really funny. So, I mean, Jack was telling his stories, and, his wife was rolling her eyes. And then the next night, same deal. It's like, oh, we're going to take Jack. And I said, well, it was a Chicago Comic Con at that point was by the airport uh, which is not downtown. So the convention started out downtown, then moved closer to the airport. So the Ramada Inn, and right in that area, within, again, short drive, they'd opened a restaurant bar called, what was it called now? It was the Roaring Twenties or something
Oh.
like that, and it was themed like a speakeasy.
Huh.
The drinks were all like that you could buy it. You get a drink, and it was in like a little ceramic bathtub. It was a
Huh.
gin drink, which was a bathtub gin was a thing with
Right.
bootleggers. People would make the booze in the bathtub or whatever. So, anyways, I said this is the perfect place to take the Kirbys, and Jack was just like his pictures of Jimmy Cagney and Everett G. Robinson and Humphrey Bogart. The places was terrific. He's just suddenly like all lit up, and he starts talking about his childhood and talking
Huh.
about it was
And this
the
is a
coolest
guy
thing.
who, he's like, you know, grows up on the Lower East Side in
Exactly.
Manhattan and is like, it's in, literally the 1920s, like the
Yeah,
bar you're
exactly.
at.
That same era. And he's saying, he says, my mother warned me never date a mall. And we're like, what? A mall, a gangster's goyle.
Right.
We're like, oh, a mall. Oh, okay. And he went on about, like as a kid and the numbers runners and the various gangster activity in his neighborhood. And it was just so funny. And then, he goes, anybody who wants to hear a war story? And his wife, like Roz, just kind of rolls her eyes and says, Jack, no one wants to hear a war story. And we're all like, yes, yes, we want to hear a war story. So she just puts her hands up and like, okay. And Jack starts telling us, all the same stories that you'd read in the interviews. So it was basically stuff that he'd clearly told before. like he's drafted by Uncle Sam. They gave him a rifle and, Hershey bars and said, "Go kill Hitler." you know, so he's telling us all this stuff, and we're just loving it. It was just the coolest. That convention was so cool. And then the next year, I went to San Diego Con, and again was lucky enough to be included in the various activities with the Kirby's, and I got to meet so many people that I didn't even know existed, but became favorites of mine, like Dan Spiegel. I was totally unaware of his stuff, except really for Blackhawk, which was, he was doing for DC with Mark and Evanier. And then he started doing other stuff, like creator-owned stuff with Evanier. But he was a really sweet guy. There's a whole bunch of people from, again, it was a West Coast thing. So it
And
was a lot of
this
people.
is San Diego Comic-Con. I mean, people think of that today, and it's now this like massive thing
Oh,
where
yeah.
there's 100,000 plus people
Yeah.
there, and it's
And the
back
first,
then it was like much more intimate, like I imagine.
yeah. Well, the first couple of years that I went, I think 70, 80, 85, 86, 87, I think we're still at the convention center in downtown, and it's surrounded by 4 hotels. And if you're at, like, these hotels are literally across the street on 4 corners, across from the convention center. And the hotel, I think we were at the Westin or something. That was the one that DC and all the creative people would be there. So you'd be in the bar, and there's Gil Kane and his wife, and you could buy them drinks. And we were afraid to talk to these people because they're like, we're still the young guys, and it was a little intimidating. But
Yeah, no, I mean, it's funny you say that because I've been at comic conventions and the past several years where I've had that exact same feeling about about people today or whatever.
well, I mean, it's
Not
always there. It's like if you're the young guy, you feel like, oh, I don't want to bother, or at least I would. I don't want to bother this person.
right.
And generally, everybody's friendly. And Gil Kane, I regret not approaching him because he would always hold the glass up and thank us. We'd buy him drinks from across the bar or something.
Right.
And I got to know him a little bit just over the phone and stuff in his later years. But you all these people were walking around. Like, there's the first show, I think the first San Diego I did, I got to meet Jerry Siegel. And it was like, oh my God, this is crazy. I was sitting at the DC table doing a signing next to the guy. And
Huh.
he
What
and
was
I
he
started,
like?
he was very quiet, but he was super nice guy. We started basically writing letters back and forth.
Oh wow.
Yeah. And he and his wife, Joanne, were both really, really nice people. You also felt worse, I think, for the various stuff that they went through, but
Yeah, of course.
they finally prevailed, I guess, unfortunately, after both he and Joanne had died. But yeah, no, they were really nice. And that was that era, though. I think I do think Jeanette Kahn did a lot of outreach, and Paul Levitz as well, and Dick Giordano. I mean, I think they tried to mend whatever bridges they could with some of the older creators as well. But yeah, it was cool. I was, like I said, sitting there with Jerry Siegel, and it was like, wow, this is nuts.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard for me to even like conceive of it.
Yeah. And so the other funny thing was, San Diego in those days was also weird in a way because you'd see like I was going to say like Chekhov from Star Trek, Walter
Right.
Koenig, or DeForest Kelley, or Majel Barrett, that they would just wander around. They would be, kind of mixing with the other guests. It wasn't it was just an interesting vibe.
Yeah, I mean, it's today it would be like they'd have like they wouldn't even be on the floor. They'd be
No,
through like
they
the
bring
back
them in the back way.
Right.
Yeah, nobody sees them unless you're on the panel or whatever. But yeah, the other thing that was fun was they used to have parties. So like Marvel would host a party one night, DC would host a party, Eclipse Comics or First Comics would host a party. So there was always activities, and at that first San Diego, I was in line at the bar, and the guy right behind me is Billy Mooney. And I'm like, oh my God, Lost in Space, Billy Mooney from Twilight, so all these shows, right? And I turned to him, I was like, oh, I got to buy you a drink. And he's like, Jerry Ordway, I love your work. And I'm
Oh
like,
wow.
my mind's blown. And
You
he
don't
was,
expect someone like that who's like not even really
but
in
he
the
was at
comic
a
book
comic
world.
convention. So, I mean,
Right,
it makes
right.
sense in a way, but yeah, and he was a huge comic fan. And again, another really super nice guy. I got to meet Miguel Ferrer through him when
Oh
RoboCop.
wow.
Well, RoboCop uh, had
Like
come
around
out.
that time, yeah.
It had come out, and he brought Miguel, and they walked around the show, and it was just fun. They were comic fans,
Huh.
But the party aspect was really kind of fun because it did give everybody a gathering place, as opposed to some of the conventions where everybody's spread out at different hotels, or you have a really tiny bar at a convention hotel where it's crowded and nobody can hear anybody. So having a party in a big hall or a big room or something was, just a good way to kind of meet people and talk to them where you weren't being drowned out by music or whatever.
Right, yeah. It's a little bit more of like an intimate setting than like
Yeah.
a packed thing.
And
Um,
so like the year in 89 when I did the Batman movie comic,
right.
that,
That's one of the things I wanted to ask about. I really like that, like your work on that. Like I think you
oh,
have like a real good eye for like the likenesses, or like real, like
oh
I could
yeah, yeah.
picture it in my head, like the Jerry Ordway, Jack Nicholson
Well, because
Joker
they're
is
they're
like.
still, yeah, I mean, they're still a little bit stylized in my style or whatever. But yeah, it was a like a really hard project to do, but I actually got through that by thinking I survived the crisis. That was what got me through.
What do you
That.
mean? What?
Well, because crisis was super stressful, and uh, oh my God, there's so much
Like, let's go back to
detail.
that a little bit, because then you did ultimately end up inking George
Yeah,
Perez
yeah,
on that,
yeah.
and that's like that's a massive series where he
Oh
is
yeah.
like, he's not going easy on you in terms of like, he's not doing, oh, here's one character on a
Right,
page. It's
right.
he's
No,
packing them in there.
yeah, there's very few single character pages in there, but he and I inked him on a 5-page or 4-page Our Man story that Roy had in like an All-Star Squadron annual, maybe in '83. So I did finally get to ink him, and George really loved it. And when Crisis was going, I'd gone to Marvel, and I was inking John Byrne on Fantastic Four. And I originally was going to do 6 months, and then they asked me to do 8. So while I was inking Fantastic Four, DC contacted me and said, we really want you to ink Crisis. Dick Giordano can't keep up with the deadlines because he's working a day job. It was crazy.
Hmm.
So and he didn't care for the. I guess Mike DiCarlo had inked an issue or maybe 2, and George was not happy with it because it wasn't what he had in his head. So George was insistent, and I was gonna start with issue 6, which would allow me to finish the Burn stuff. And then I got a crisis phone call saying you have to start with issue 5 or George is gonna quit. Now I don't know how true that is, but I'm hearing this from the editorial coordinator, and she was pretty convincing. So I had like an overlap of inking Burn and also inking the first issue of Crisis, issue 5, and also inking DC Presents Annual, which Julie Schwartz wouldn't let me out of. So I had this crazy month and a half where I had done something like, I guess the annual was 38 pages, 22 pages for the Fantastic Four, and then like 25 pages for Crisis. It was a crazy, crazy month, and I somehow got it done. I had a studio in Milwaukee at the time, and Al Vey was trying to get work. And I told Al, I said, if you'll do backgrounds on stuff that, like straight line stuff, filling in blacks, erasing the pages, just being an all around helper, I said, I'll pay you, I'll pay for food, we'll eat, and we worked like probably 13-hour days at the studio. And I'd order pizza or whatever. We ate and then we'd work more. And we got
Hmm.
something like 5 pages a month, 5 pages a day, 6 pages some days done to get the deadline. But yeah, that was tough. It was just stressful because, no one could have done what George did. I was inking it. I mean, that was a lot of work, but it wasn't the same amount of work as having that story in your head and putting it down on paper. That's just an amazing feat just in itself. But by virtue of that, with the amount of characters and the fact that George wouldn't cut corners, if he just was a fan, he wanted to see these characters meeting each other or whatever it was. And
Right. At that time too, like that book kind of meant a lot in the sense of like that was like the end. Like
Yeah.
we're gonna end the DC. I mean, I know, in comic books nothing ever ends, but I mean,
Right.
you know, at that time that had never been done before. The idea
Yeah.
that like we're gonna kill off the universe and reboot it,
Right.
like that's a completely, and a lot of these characters, now the idea of like the multiverse is a totally normal thing.
Yeah.
It's in everything. There's Across the Spider-Verse, and there's a million TV shows and movies like that. But back then, it's like, uh,
It was
first
special.
one, Superman is gonna meet, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster Superman. Like,
Yeah.
I don't know.
I mean, here's the thing though. One of the big aspects I think that people don't think about is Crisis came out every month. In the 12 issues, there were multiple double size issues. So the Death of Flash issue was they were all like 25, 26, 27 pages, plus Death of Supergirl was a double size issue. It was a lot more than just a monthly, but each issue had to come out on time because the other DC books that came out within that week, that book or whatever,
they all depended on that.
Yeah, so they tied into stuff. So you needed it to come out on time because it was the leading thing. It wasn't the tail wagging the dog. It was, those other books were dependent on it.
Yeah, I mean, so even as you just say, like, Death of Death of the Flash, which extends back to the Silver Age. Like, arguably, to some people, I think some people even cite that as one of the things that they consider sort of the end of the Silver Age.
Yeah.
Death of the Flash, Death of Supergirl. Like, at that time, it must have, this is unheard of. Like, at that time, it must have been like, that's like killing George Washington. It's like
well, and there were a lot of other characters that died in the story as well.
Right. Like
those were the
hundreds,
big ones.
I guess.
Yeah, they had lists of characters that were kind of cannon fodder in a way. But I mean, George gave everybody a little moment to shine in all those panels, and that's one of the things that, again, is something that I think when you're doing any book with multiple characters like that, it's called fan service, but it's also, that was coming from him. I mean, he wanted to see these various characters get together or to fight or whatever, because, the little kid in him wanted that, and he felt like the fans wanted it. He had to do it. But the problem was he was only doing a couple pages. So he had to do 2 pages a day of pencils. That's really just how it worked. But the deadline was so tight. I would get 2 pages via FedEx. Like, I'd come in the studio at say 10 in the morning, FedEx package, someone else down the hall had signed for it for me. So the package is there. I'd look at those pages. I have to literally ink those pages, make up a FedEx package for the end of the evening, call for a pickup, and have FedEx come at 8 o'clock at night and make sure that those pages are done and the package is wrapped up. And they would go to DC. So it was like that during that whole process. There was never a point where, here's 8 pages, and then you could just do all 8 pages and then send them in. It was always pages, two pages at a time, sometimes even one page at a time, just to keep the production stuff going, because it would go from me to DC to the colorist, production, whatever they needed to do. And sometimes it was, towards the end, like I think issues 8, around that time, sometimes pages would come without the lettering on them, which meant that the letterer would be lettering it, and someone at DC would have to paste the balloons onto the pages after they were inked. So it was all down to the wire. But again, in those days, the deadlines were different and the lead time was different because they still had newsstand. So there was you had a very firm 3-month gap from when you finished it, when it was inked, to when it was on the stands. It was at least 3 months, but you couldn't violate that. Nowadays people are drawing books and finishing them up, and they're printed the next week or that weekend, and they're in stores in a week. It's
right. Yeah. And a lot of people don't
nuts.
work on, they don't work on paper at all. So there's no,
Yeah.
it's not like, oh, I'm going to FedEx you the pages. It's just
Right. You're not waiting on FedEx. You're electronically sending it, even if you do it at 4 a.m. or something. But yeah, it's all that stuff was crazy, but that was such a stressful project. And again, I was the inker. I was finisher. I mean, George, look, all I need you to do is you can be a little sloppy if you want, but you got to have the costume details, because I don't know who all these characters are.
right.
There's no
And
way
there's
for me to
100.
check. Yeah. And
There's
I
no
mean,
Wikipedia.
there's nothing to look it up. I mean, if you're working on a page, you can't go to a comic store at 2 a.m. and you're not,
Right.
it just time to go to a comic store or find somebody who might have a copy of something. So it really was, you just had to do it. So George had the reference. George knew who the characters were and what their powers were. The other thing you don't understand, a lot of people don't understand, is also probably out of an issue, a 25-page issue, there could be 8 pages in that thing that had overlays, meaning you'd have to use vellum, which is translucent, I guess is a better word. And you'd put vellum over the page, and you'd have to ink this blast effect. You would use black ink, but it would print as red. So you're almost doing a color separation for them. And there were a couple of pages where George had he had red and blue color holds. So that meant you'd have to do two overlays with the, with the vellum. And when they started returning art, a lot of times those vellums never came back, which is a shame. So I think they had to recreate all of those when they finally collected Crisis as a trade paperback, because I doubt that a lot of that existed, and the artwork had been returned years before that. So
it's just funny to think of it this way, because you mentioned a trade paperback, and that's how I read it as a kid, and it's just funny to think of this like, from my perspective, it's like Crisis is like the Iliad or something, and it's it's just something that's just like, oh, this is a bunch of stone tablets that I have here. And it's like, it's funny to think of it from the perspective of like, this was coming down to the wire, every night, intense deadlines.
Well, you're seeing it as a full, you're seeing it as a full book. It's much different than like even, Watchmen, when Watchmen was coming out, the last maybe 4 or 5 issues of Watchmen were much delayed. And it's to DC's credit, it's to DC's credit that they waited rather than, having a fill-in issue or something.
Oh yeah, you couldn't do that. Yeah, that would have been madness. Yeah,
but there was a huge gap for the last issue. I remember that. And those were like the first books to ship late, But DC made that decision. I remember hearing about that. It actually, the first time, it may have come up even before that, when Camelot 3000, was that Camelot 3000? Do you know the book?
I know what you're talking about, but I don't know
what
year.
Brian Boland was the artist on it, and one of the issues was going to miss shipping, and I guess in the DC editorial meeting, they had like a big argument about whether it mattered whether that book missed shipping. And I remember hearing, at least I wasn't there, but I heard that, Dick Giordano was standing up for the fact that, look, if you put, some artist on a fill-in for that thing, he said, it's just going to look
Watchmen?
bad. And no, we're talking about this
Oh, for
Camelot
Camelot 3000.
3000. It says, if you put a fill-in on, it's going to do more damage, because ultimately we know that books like this are going to get collected, and someone buying it, when it's in a collected form, is going to say, why isn't Brian Boland doing this issue? So that
And
was
this was
like,
at a time when like the idea of collecting these books was still like
yeah,
fairly new.
it was new. Yeah, it was new. And I think Dark Knight had been, and Ronin were both collected through, I think, Warner Books, because it was a separate arm at the time. So it was a big deal for them to get, because that meant they were going to be in new bookstores. Yeah, I mean, it's funny, a lot of this stuff that happened, if you jumped in, like what was the first year of your comic collecting that you can remember? What
Me?
year?
I mean, I probably was a similar age to you, of like probably around 9 or 10 or so. And
Yeah,
I'm going to, Barnes and Nobles, I'm going to
yeah,
Borders, and I'm not getting single issues. Probably the first things that I got
yeah,
like thick,
yeah,
essential, like Marvel Essentials were probably the first things I got,
right.
which were like, I don't even know, 300-page thick phone book
So
sized.
what year would that be?
Probably 1998, I want to
Yeah,
say,
yeah,
maybe earlier.
yeah. Because I mean, the market changed so much in that, really in that period of the 90s was a big change. But um, Crisis didn't get reprinted until like 98. It was done by, I think it was done by Graffiti as a nice hardcover. And I was lobbying from the late 80s, when I would be on a DC panel at conventions. I would just poll the audience to try to get, the people on the panel, like if it was Mike Carlin or one of the editors, to know that there was this audience out there. I'd say, who wants to see Crisis, collected? And people, all these hands would come up.
Huh.
And DC would always say, well, we can't afford to do it because we have to recolor it, and we'd have to charge too much. And then I'd say, well, who would pay extra? And hands would go up. And I did this year after year.
Huh.
And it's
It's kind
nuts,
of funny to
because,
think that they didn't, it's like, it's gonna be worth the investment to
well, I
pay
think,
for these
but you know
colors.
what? I
Like,
think in a way, withholding it kind of helped its aura to a degree as
right.
well. And, by withholding it, it became, why isn't this collected? Why isn't this collected? So that when it did get collected, it sold really well in like a hardcover, probably a $25 hardcover or something. And it's been in print in various, reprint forms since 98. There's probably 10 editions.
Hey, so I hope you've been enjoying my chat with Jerry Ordway so far. It ended up running pretty long, around 3 hours and 20 minutes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to split it up into 3 parts. And just to spice things up and keep you on your toes a bit, I'm going to space them out. So next week will be someone besides Jerry. Then the week after will be part 2 with Jerry. Then another surprise guest again. And finally, part 3 the week after that. Okay, I think I've over-explained that enough. Next week. Take care.